Is there time?
Yeah, just for a second.
Okay.
Are we starting? Yay! Thank you all for joining us. My name is Novella Ford. I'm the Associate Director for Public Programs and Exhibitions here at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Today we will be discussing Invisible, the forgotten story of the black woman lawyer who took down America's biggest mobster by Stephen L. Carter. And we are joined here by Stephen L. Carter as well as his daughter Leah Carter. We are here coming to you live from the Schomburg shop, which is located at 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard. And you, as you will read through this book, find many stops like the Schomburg Center found here in this particular book, in the storytelling of Eunice's life. Stephen L. Carter is the best-selling author of 6 novels, including Jericho's Fall and New England White, and 8 works of nonfiction. His novel, The Emperor of Ocean Park, which is actually how I've come to your work, spent 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Formerly a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, he is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Yale University, where he has taught for more than 35 years. Carter is also currently a columnist for the Bloomberg View. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Novella. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Also joining us is Leah Carter, a researcher and former lawyer. In 2012, she graduated from Yale Law School, where she was an editor on the Journal of Law and Feminism. We're going to learn more about Leah as we discuss this book because she was the principal researcher for Invisible. So to let you all know, this season of programs at the Schomburg Center has really been about unearthing these stories of women who have been important to American politics as well as culture, but who we know very little about. We may actually know their names, like Lorraine Hansberry, but too little has actually been written about them. We're doing Lorraine Hansberry, we did Polly Murray, who is a lawyer, or at least went to law school and certainly used her practice as part of her activism. And next week we'll be talking about Gwendolyn Bennett, who actually shows up in the book as well. But I'm glad that today we get to add Eunice Hunton Carter as part of the conversation. So I'm going to read a piece from the prologue that I think helps set us up as the Schomburg Center sits at the intersection of both history as well as contemporary moment. In it you say, in the fall of 2014, 2 episodes of HBO's Boardwalk Empire, which is set during and just after Prohibition, featured a black female lawyer who worked for the New York District Attorney. The role was small. She had perhaps 2 lines. Still, viewers were incredulous. Online comment threads swiftly filled with mockery. Ridiculous. Anachronistic. One post after another insisted that there weren't black lawyers back then, not black women lawyers anyway. And certainly there were no black female prosecutors. The casting, the skeptics insisted, was just another example of Hollywood political correctness run amok. But they were wrong. My Nana Eunice was real and really did prosecute mobsters and lived a life so remarkable that her story should have been told long ago. I am grateful for the opportunity to tell it now. I'm grateful that you have decided to tell this story now. What has been gained, or what do we gain when we include stories like Eunice Hunton Carter's, and why is the story important?
I think there are a lot of things, and I actually like to hear Leah's take on this as coming from a younger generation as well. But there are a couple of things that I want to emphasize, that we tend to see everything that happens as new. This has never happened before. No one's ever gone through this before. And it's useful to be reminded of the stories from the past of enormous challenge and enormous triumph. Let me just mention one small aspect of her story. Yes, she was the first black woman prosecutor in New York. Yes, she prosecuted mob figures. She was involved in the founding of the United Nations. She did a lot of other things. But in today's climate, let me mention one thing in particular, that in the 1930s, when no one else was talking about this issue, she was an activist for women in the workplace who were being mistreated by their bosses. She talked publicly about what we now call sexual harassment. She talked publicly about women being pressured for, as she said, intimate relationships by the men that they worked with. She said boiling oil is a little too good for that kind of men. So she was an activist in all sorts of causes that we tend to think of as new, and she was doing this, again, back 80 years ago or so.
Leah? I think it's just really important to tell a variety of stories about black history, and particularly about black women's history. When I think back often to the sort of education I received in school on black history, it's sort of often a very simple story of, you know, there was slavery, and then there was Jim Crow, and then since the civil rights movement, black people have started to do things. And I think it's really it wasn't quite that bad, but I think, you know, that is kind of the narrative. And I just think it's incredibly important to tell these stories about black people who were doing all sorts of things and being influential in society in various ways long before the time that we think things like that happened. And especially about black women.
Were you going to answer that?
I'm sorry? No, I agree. I agree.
So tell us about Eunice the lawyer and the case of Louisiana.
So you have to imagine a little bit, you're back in the 1930s, you're in a heavily segregated society. Organized crime is running New York. People are up in arms. And so under pressure, the mayor finally appoints a man named Tom Dewey, who later ran for president, as the special prosecutor for organized crime. And Dewey quickly hires 20 lawyers to help him. The press labels them 20 against the underworld. That was what they called them. And it's 19 white males and 1 black woman. hired to everyone's surprise, Eunice. And the headline for the hiring around the country in all the newspapers was Dewey hires black woman. If you look at the New York Times, when he announced his staff, she's the only one who has a photograph. And it's not because she was the best known necessarily at the time, although she later became one of the best known black women in America, but rather it is because no one could understand this black woman is being hired. But then she got hired, and Dewey had these offices, and she was put at the end of this long corridor, and all the other people in the office were working on trying to get Lucky Luciano on murder charges or on loan sharking charges or on drug charges or something like that, some kind of corruption charges. She was put to work on prostitution, which Dewey, the prosecutor, didn't even want to prosecute. It was thought to be a backwater. It's where women prosecutors were often being sent. The irony is that from that beginning, sent all the way in this end of this hallway, nowhere near the seat of power, she ended up putting together the theory under which, like, Luciano was finally convicted, prostitution being the only crime of which he was actually convicted.
So then take us through the case. Let us know why Eunice became headline news.
So,
and that'll help us set the stage for who she was both before as well as after.
When I was growing up, the story in my family that I was always told was that the prostitutes who were turning state's evidence at the time, or they're trying to turn state's evidence, were heavily black, and Eunice was the only person they would talk to in the prosecutor's office. Actually, that's not actually what happened. It's that she was the only person assigned to talk to them. But at the time, the thought was that the mob was not involved in prostitution. That's what most people believed, that the mob was involved in, said, loan sharking and these various other businesses. Prostitution was thought to be a bunch of little independents. No one thought there was any central apparatus. Eunice, alone in this office, just by interviewing a lot of people and doing a lot of research, working hard, was able to demonstrate there was actually a central criminal apparatus that largely controlled prostitution in New York. She finally persuaded Dewey to allow her to supervise the police in a series of raids.
Which is fascinating to read about.
It was 1936, and it was a very cold night, and the police hit 80 suspected brothels simultaneously, or they were supposed to 80, actually they hit only 40 for various reasons. But in order to avoid any leaks, they had all these police who weren't vice cops and never worked together before, and those are the people who then did the raids. They did the raids, they arrested these women. Eunice was charged with supervising this whole system of the raids was under control, the arrest was under control. And you have to remember, this is a black woman in 1936, and ultimately was the one who arranged the systems that got some of them talking. When some of them began to talk, it turned out that some of them actually witnessed Luciano making various comments to associates that showed he's running a business, and that's how he finally got convicted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now, wasn't it, if I recall correctly, when she presented this idea or this theory, she actually had to work with another, like maybe his number two, to present this to him where he actually took it in as a possibility?
When Eunice was working this idea alone, it was generally thought that it wasn't very important. And whenever anything came about prostitution, any kind of complaint from citizens, it would just be dumped on her desk, whether it was a letter or an interview or anything else. But when she finally decided she was ready to present it to Dewey, she actually went to another lawyer in the office, Wilfred Feinberg, who later became a very distinguished federal judge, and was able to persuade him to go with her to Dewey, to persuade Dewey to take a chance on this, yes.
And I bring that up because I do think it's an interesting point to come back to when you talk about her trajectory and what did she do to help it along, or maybe is the reason for possibly stalling in some way.
Well, she was part of what made her able to accomplish this, and later to become, I said, one of the best known black women in America, was her fortitude, her family inheritance, the background she had, which is actually something that Leah did a lot of research on.
So a lot of my research was focused on Eunice's father, William Hunton, who traveled around the country opening what were then called colored chapters of the YMCA. And this work was incredibly important to him. He believed that it was very important to the black race to have sort of Christian education for men and have sort of the YMCA chapters for them. And he traveled around to several cities a week, just all over the country, helping to open these chapters. And he ended up, I think, working himself to death doing this. But this was something he believed in, and he really didn't as much as he loved his family, he didn't really spend that much time with them. And as much as
very little time.
Yeah, and even though he was in poor health, he was constantly pushing through to do this. And I think he inherited that from his father, who was enslaved in Virginia. He escaped 3 times, ultimately ended up purchasing his freedom and moving to Canada and starting a life there and becoming very successful. And I think, there's something, I'm referring to it as the hunting determination. There's just something there that,
There's something there.
Yeah. And Eunice definitely had it. Like, she just, certainly you can see it in her work with Dewey, where she just kept pushing the prostitution angle. I think a lot of people, after the first time their boss said, no, we don't want to do that, it's not interesting, would have just been like, okay, this isn't the thing that's going to happen. But even in other areas of her life, I think you can see, I reviewed a lot of her correspondence within the National Council of Negro Women, in which she was very active. And, if there was some issue in the way the organization was being run that she thought was a problem, she would just keep pushing and writing letters and more letters, and I really think we need to think about this, we really need to talk about this. She just didn't let go of things that were important to her.
And what were you doing in your life when your father started working on this project? And then you put it all down to do other
I was a lawyer, also a lawyer. I was working at a big law firm, and my dad, he started working on the book before I joined him, and it was just really
But not as successfully until you joined him.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It was just, he was sharing all this interesting information he was learning, and I realized I didn't really know anything about Eunice. I knew that she'd been a prosecutor, that she'd been instrumental in prosecuting Lucky Luciano. I knew that she had a brother who was a communist who'd been to jail, and that was really it. And learning so much interesting stuff about her family and about her and her relationship with Alpheus. I just started getting very interested in the project.
Mm-hmm. And so Alpheus's papers are actually here at the Schomburg Center. But how did you do a lot of this primary research on Eunice?
So we don't have access to a collection of Eunice's papers, unfortunately. So there's so the information, most of what we have about her childhood, or a lot of what we have about her childhood, is from her father's letters, which are at Howard. And then the archives of the National Council of Negro Women are in the National Archives for Black Women's History, which is in Maryland, and those places in the Schomburg are where I spent most of my time. A lot of what I personally learned about Eunice in my research, I would say, was from the National Council of Negro Women files, which has just a ton of correspondence, and also minutes of board meetings, which she sometimes spoke in. And additionally, I wasn't really involved in this part of the research, but there's information in the New York Municipal Archives from the DA's office.
Mm-hmm. And now, what is it like to write about a family member, particularly a grandmother, right? Because relationships between a parent and a child is one thing, but your grandmother, she can often be different towards her grandchildren than she is to her children.
My grandmother scared us. She was this tough, stern, very well-spoken woman. She would correct your grammar in an instant. She thought her grandchildren didn't have good manners, and she wanted to take us and teach us how to have proper manners, teach my sisters when to wear white gloves and so on, and at tea and all this sort of thing. She was a formidable woman. Those qualities that frightened us when we were little, and we were scared of her, but those qualities are exactly what helped her to get through, to accomplish all of these things. And I have to say that when I started working on this project, I didn't realize how much she'd accomplished. In particular, I knew about the prosecution a little bit. What I didn't know was that for the next 10 years after prosecuting Lucky Luciano, that she was one of the best-known black women in the country. She was featured in Life magazine. There's a magazine called Liberty magazine, which is long gone, was the second biggest magazine in the country at the time. A long series of features there. There were a lot of other places. She was on the radio with Vivian Lee and Laurence Olivier and all these different things that she did. She was in the white press and the black press a lot. And other interesting stories. So she was a Republican. And nowadays, people think black Republicans. Of course, back then, black people were mostly Republican. Not only that, the Republican Party at the time was really seen as the party of civil rights. And when her mentor, Tom Dewey, ran for president, he ran in 1944 and 1948 on the most pro-civil rights plank anyone had ever run. And he openly courted black voters. He went to black political meetings. He was unashamed of it in a way that no politician did before. And on the stump, he talked about Eunice, and he talked about her a lot. He would say that as evidence that I have no prejudice. He said the biggest bureau in the New York District Attorney's office, which was called Special Sessions at the time, is run by a black woman, he would say, and that was Eunice he was talking about. He'd say, my wife and I have had Eunice Carter to dinner in our house. He would say this on the stump, and I challenge my opponent to tell us when he's had, a black woman to dinner at his house, things like this. And that, of course, also helped raise her public profile. She would be out campaigning and so on. Later, of course, politics changed. But at the time, to be a black Republican was not unusual. Most black people, certainly most black leaders, were, and she became enormously famous in those circles as well, and influential as well.
That's the cover, actually, of this book, is her participating in a GOP conference.
So the cover of the book is a meeting of black Republicans who are trying to work out the platform plank for the GOP's 1944 convention. And it's a picture of her refusing to yield the floor when there's a black man here who's trying to get her to yield, and she's going to make her point. She's not going to be shut down by some man saying, no, I want to, I have something to say. And in the cover photo, she's pointing down at the ground as if to say, here I stand. I have the floor, and that was the way she was. She was very tough. So she scared us, as I said, but that toughness, that sternness that I remember, she died when I was a young teenager, but that toughness that I remember is what enabled her to succeed in all the many ways that she did.
Mm-hmm. So then take us back before she became a lawyer. How did she grow up? What was her time like in Harlem?
So Eunice was born in Atlanta in 1899. The family arrived in Atlanta just about the time of the lynching of Sam Hose, a fellow named Sam Hose. I mention that because there were many, many lynchings, all of them quite horrible. The lynching of Sam Hose is generally regarded as perhaps the worst. He was the one who, it's a true story, it's not something that was made up, that after he was lynched and his body was cut to pieces, the pieces were sold in local stores. You could go buy them. This actually happened. And his family considered leaving Atlanta, her family, but they stayed. She was born in 1899 in Atlanta. The family left after the Atlanta riot of 1906, in which dozens and maybe hundreds of black people were killed. We don't have numbers. No one kept track of dead black people in those days. According to family legend, the riot stopped one house away from theirs, which may well be true. Certainly, it was quite nearby. The family moved to Brooklyn. After which, as Leah was saying, her father then was never home because most of his work was in Atlanta and Washington or around the world, where he was traveling constantly. Her mother started working for the YWCA, where she became actually a considerable activist, and then for the NAACP, where she actually was sent into the Badlands, so to speak, that there were towns all over the South and the Midwest where the black community had been completely intimidated by the local Klan, and her mother, Addie Hunton, was sent by herself to go to these towns and try to rouse the locals back to a sense of energy, back to a sense of what we now call efficacy, I suppose. So she has this background, and Leah described her father's activism and her grandfather she never met but adored. That these people, she had this background of a family that accomplished and accomplished and accomplished simply by refusing to be held back. Her father's philosophy, his basic civil rights philosophy was, if the white people will leave us alone, we can do anything that we want to do. That was basically his view. He wanted his kids to be educated, and they were. Leah mentioned earlier her brother. She had a younger brother named Alpheus, who was also very well educated and very accomplished, who became a communist. And I don't mean he was called a communist. I mean, he really was a communist, and a very important communist. And their lives diverged. And I think that to the end of her days, Eunice believed that some of the things she coveted, like being a judge, that she never got to do because her brother, the communist, was busy building an FBI file that ended up being 700 pages long. And I think she believed, perhaps correctly, that held her back.
And so I want to trouble that water a little bit, right? Because she was this accomplished woman. She was well connected. She advocated on behalf of Dewey, during his various candidacies for district attorney and then for governor, president twice, and yet she never received sort of that golden ticket, a judgeship or a Tony appointment within the government. So I know part of it is this idea that she had this brother who was a communist and that was working in the background. But I also posited maybe she wasn't campaigning for herself in the same way that she did. She believed in hard work.
She did believe in hard work, and she wasn't very politically skilled. She had a mouth. She would say what she thought. Isn't that right?
Yes.
You saw that in the letters, right? She would say what she thought. She didn't care who she upset. So there's certainly that. And I know that she offended a lot of people over the years. All the way back in the 1920s, she was at a meeting of black Republicans where a white speaker from the Republican National Committee came. And she stands up in the back of the room, and nobody knows who she is. And she starts lambasting him for, I know you've been reaching out to these white Southerners and this and this and this and this, and we're not going to vote for you if you do this and this. She would speak her mind. But so what held her back, you're asking? So first let's go back to her resume. So she has her 10 years in the DA's office. She's run several very important investigations. She develops the first juvenile justice bureau in New York. The New York juvenile justice system today is largely built on a model that she pioneered in the 1940s, and then suddenly she stops. Suddenly the forward motion stops. She leaves that. She does get involved with the founding of the United Nations. She's involved in some international organizations. She thinks she's going to be the head of the National Council of Negro Women. Everybody expects that, but it doesn't happen. So what went wrong? So part of what went wrong, and it's an important part, is her brother and the whole McCarthy era, the red baiting era of the late 40s and early 50s, when it was very hard to get ahead if you had any sort of communist relationship. And her brother definitely hurt her that way. It is also the case she was not very political. She did offend people. She offended Mrs. Bethune on more than one occasion. So those are two of the markers. The other thing is, but balancing that, I should say, is that she was very ambitious. She made no secret of the things that she wanted. Everybody knew she wanted to be a judge. When Dewey became the governor of New York, everybody knew she wanted a cabinet post because he was determined to appoint a black person to his cabinet, which he did, but he appointed somebody else. There were a number of times that she thought she was going to get these posts, and there was a sense, a black woman is going to get this, but it kept going to somebody else. There's something that we don't really know that went wrong with the well-oiled machine that was her career in the late 40s or early 50s. Something didn't go right. We don't know exactly what it was. But clearly, in addition to the brother, who was clearly, I think, the biggest cause, in addition to her ability to get herself in trouble by opening her mouth and saying what she thought, there was something else, must have been, but we don't know what that was. And maybe it was just her brother and her tendency to offend people. Maybe that's all that it was.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that based on your research?
One thing I would say is I do think, she did get herself in trouble, and I do think sometimes it was because she was trying to advocate for herself, but she wasn't necessarily, as my dad said, she wasn't very political. She wasn't smooth about it. So, for example, one issue she had with Mary McLeod Bethune was in the 40s there was an opportunity for the National Council of Negro Women to send a representative on the Town Hall of the Air World Tour, which was a very exciting thing at the time.
And this being at a time, remember, when black people did not know people from the United States, routinely traveled around the world. So going around the world was a big deal, I'm saying.
Yeah, so she wanted to be chosen for it, and the correspondence around this issue was a little murky. It was hard to figure out exactly what happened, but it seems like she wasn't chosen. And it seems that ultimately she had a huge fight with Mary McLeod Bethune because she, when she wasn't chosen, made a big deal of it and accused Bethune of having betrayed her, basically. And so I think this is something she was trying to advocate for herself, but she did it in a way that sort of destroyed one of her most important relationships.
Right, because she was present, Eunice was, at the meeting where the National Council of Negro Women was founded, and she was the chair of the board for many, many years, and she was the chair still, I think, when all this was happening.
Yes.
And so, yes, it was widely thought in the press that she would succeed Bethune, but after this fight they had over the town hall meeting, which nowadays may seem very small, but for those days to have an opportunity to go on an official State Department junket around the world was huge, and everybody, the American Bankers Association, any group you can think of, was sending people on this tour. When someone else was chosen, it really wounded her, and she couldn't leave it alone. Months later, she was still coming back to it. She just couldn't leave it alone.
Let's talk about Eunice the Internationalist, because she does, sort of after her work in the DA's office or in that particular space, when that didn't take her exactly where she wanted to go, she moved into the Negro Council, the National Council of Negro Women, but she decided that she was going to become an internationalist, and she found that work very rewarding, and doing work with the UN on her own and outside of the association.
She did. She worked with the International Council of Women. She worked with the Conference of Non-Governmental Organizations. They kept changing the name of it, but basically that's what it basically was. It was the Conference of Non-Governmental Organizations. And with a number of these other groups internationally, she was constantly traveling abroad. It was interesting, and you can see again both the talent and the drive, with all these various organizations she was involved in, she would always wind up one of the leaders of it. So, for example, the Council of Non-Governmental Organizations, the head of which won the Nobel Peace Prize a year later, she became the secretary, the treasurer. And with the International Council of Women, she became head of the Legal Affairs Committee and then became a vice president and so on. So if you get involved in these international organizations, and that's the life that I remember is of her when I was a kid. She was always going somewhere. She was always leaving the country, usually by ship because she was afraid of flying. So she would always be going somewhere. We'd be dropping her off at a ship or meeting her at a ship or something or something like that. And that was a life, and I think it was rewarding for her. But I still think that she would rather have had the life of the trajectory she thought she was on. She'd rather have been a major figure as a judge, or a major figure, say, in Republican politics by being some kind of federal official, at least some kind of major state official, all things that she thought were coming to her, all things that never did come to her.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so in your book you mention, or you note that it is a curse of historians to judge the past by the norms of the present. And so I wonder, in this particular moment, we're about to go into an election year, or election season, and we're talking about voter suppression, which was considered, when her brother was doing voter drives with Negroes, it's like a communist activity to do. But Eunice was also very much called upon to advocate for whatever the candidate in the black community, sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully. What kind of parallels do you see between now and then?
So it's true that Eunice was big in politics in the sense she was constantly campaigning for people, usually Republicans. Again, remember, this is back in the days the Republicans were the party of civil rights, and the Democrats were the segregationist party. But also, she actually did do some what you can think of as anti-voter suppression work. I'll give you one little example that I mention in the book, that she herself ran for office once, and when she was running, she handled a case of people whose voter registration was denied in New York because they had given business addresses instead of home addresses, and she took that case pro bono, and she won. And the court ruled that you could use a business address or a home address under the language of the statute as then stood to register as a voter. But I know, Lee, you've done some thinking about parallels as well.
Yeah, I think certainly working on this book in this political moment has been very interesting for me. I started the work in mid-2016. So since then, a lot of things have happened that have really could have led me, I think, to a lot of despair. And I think that working on the book has actually helped me to not despair. It sort of reminds me that, for one thing, things used to be way worse, and they got better. And which sounds very simple to say, but just a reminder, because I think so often it can feel like, we're just in a downward trajectory that will last forever. And, a reminder that things can change, that things can get better. There were so many moments when, we've talked about the Hunt and determination and William and Addie and Eunice, and there were so many moments when they could have sort of thrown up their hands in despair and said the world is unjust and nothing can be done, like after the Atlanta riots, or sort of less severely when Eunice got her job in Dewey's office and then was assigned, prostitution. But they didn't. And unfortunately, the world has always been unjust, but there is also always something that can be done, and I think the book really helped to remind me of that.
Mm-hmm. And then also, as a student, you did you edit the journal for?
I was an articles editor.
You were an articles editor. Do you have anything to say about both Addie as well as Eunice's take on gender issues, particularly around women, and sort of parallels to today?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what Addie or Eunice would think today about being a woman in sort of modern society. I know Addie was a very interesting figure because she spent a lot of time when she was traveling and lecturing talking about the importance of black motherhood and how, as a black woman, your most important job was to raise the next generation, even though she was gone a lot of the time while she was off giving this talk. Someone else was taking care of her kids, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. It's just an interesting thing. And she, I think Eunice ended up doing the same thing with my grandfather. He spent a lot of his childhood in Barbados without either of his parents there. And I think both of them they were women who had work that they thought needed to be done. They weren't going to let expectations about the family and what their role should be in the family get in the way of their work. They were both, I think, women who believed they should be taken seriously and were worthy of respect. And I think it's hard to say what they would be doing if they were alive now or what their positions they would be taking on things, but I'm sure they would be out there doing whatever they thought was important and demanding respect for it.
And it's interesting when you talk about her mother, Addie. Addie gave a speech in 1903, where she talked about the importance of men treating their wives better. And then, as I mentioned before, Eunice in the 1930s, of course, was talking about the treatment of women in the workplace. So clearly, I think they had these sentiments at a time when most people weren't giving this much, if any, thought. Well, I'm sure a lot of women are giving this a lot of thought, but in the larger world, people weren't talking about this much at all.
Mm-hmm. And so as we're about to wrap up, I do have two more questions for you. One is about Eunice's creative writing life before she became a lawyer, and particularly because we recently did a talk around Pauli Murray, and of all the things that she was also a poet. And so she published a small collection of poetry. I want to say maybe it's the only collection of poetry that she actually published. Do you have any interest in publishing or republishing any of Eunice's short stories and essays that were out in the world?
So interestingly, Eunice, before she went to law school, was interested in writing. She did a lot of creative writing. She published a number of short stories. She published a number of book reviews. She was one of the women who was involved in the early days of the Harlem Renaissance. She was inducted in the Harlem Writers Guild. And most of those are available. A couple of them actually still being republished in various collections today. I will say this, she wrote beautifully. A lot of her writing was in a journal called Opportunity, which you can find in a lot of libraries. Unfortunately, it's not freely available online. At one point, we considered putting some kind of epilogue or some kind of collection appendix or something in the back of the book that would include some of her work, but that was just going to end up being too complicated to do. But some of her work you can find online, and she wrote really with enormous beauty and power, and I think could have been a really important writer, but for whatever reason she was drawn instead to go to law school and enter a life of a different kind of public service.
And so would you recommend any companion books to this as you did all this research, whether or not it's about Harlem, Black women lawyers, politics?
So about Harlem, I would recommend 2 books by Amelia Bundles, which were both very helpful actually in research for this book. Amelia Bundles is Madam C.J. Walker's, I believe, great-great-granddaughter. I hope I'm getting that right.
That's right.
And so she had a book called On Her Own Ground about Madam C.J. Walker, which was very interesting because I feel like there's sort of, in the vein of sort of how there's a single story about everything, there's Madam C.J. Walker, there's this sort of, she invented the hot comb or whatever, makes the hot comb, and that's sort of her story. Right. And her story is much more interesting. Yeah. So that's an excellent book. And then she also has a forthcoming book called The Joy Goddess of Harlem, which is about Madam Walker's daughter, Amelia. So I would definitely recommend both of those.
And for people who want to read more about pioneering black lawyers, men and women, there's a book by Kenneth Mack called Representing the Race, which talks about a lot of the great black lawyers of the day. There were a lot of black women lawyers of the day whose names we've forgotten. There was a woman named Ruth Whaley, who was a very important lawyer. And Sadie Alexander, who was a pioneering black lawyer even before Eunice. A woman named Edith Sampson, who was a prosecutor in Chicago and became sometimes a friend and sometimes a rival of Eunice's. Jane Boleyn. There were so many other books about Harlem. There's a couple of wonderful books about Harlem, one by David Levering Lewis, one by Jervis Anderson, both of which, if you want to take a look at Harlem of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the era this is about, what they used to say, the era when Harlem was Harlem, people used to say, both wonderful pieces on that, and a little bit of self-promotion. I wrote a novel that was set in Harlem of the 1950s and 1960s called Palace Council, which came out about 10 years ago, which I'm sure people can also find.
Find it at your local library, as well as some of the books that may be out of publication. I'm sure you can find those here at the Schomburg Center. So we do have a question from online, so we're going to take that.
Okay.
Are there any children's books about Miss Carter?
Children's books about her? I didn't come across any, did you? It's a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
It's a great That's a great idea.
It's a great idea.
We should work on that, you and I.
I'd be interested.
You would? All right.
Here first.
We're going to do that. We hadn't thought of that. That's a great idea.
Yes. Thank you to the questioner. That's actually
Thank you, Charlena. Yes, Charlena, for that question. So I don't know how often you two will be together on this tour talking about this book, but do you have any questions for each other that you've been curious about that maybe you hadn't asked each other in the process?
Actually, I do have one.
And I have one for you afterwards. So.
Okay. So,
pardon me.
I know you've written a lot of nonfiction and you've written a lot of novels, but this is your first work of historical nonfiction or biography. And I was just wondering whether the process for writing it was very different and how you liked the process compared to the process for writing a novel or a nonfiction book.
I would never do this again. It was a labor of love. I mean, it took years to do this, but I would never do this research again. I'm not a professional biographer. I've written a lot of nonfiction books and a lot of fiction, but the process of writing a biography, of trying to get inside someone's head and getting it right, was much harder than I thought. I mean, I am so in awe and admiration of people who write biographies regularly. It's a very, very important art form. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to help bring Eunice's story to a larger public. I do think it's a very inspiring story, but it was hard. It was very hard. It was hard in a way that writing hasn't been hard for me before. It was the day to day, this happened on this day, this happened the next day, putting together these different sources to put together a timeline of what happened and so on. I couldn't have done my research, so I had a lot of students who worked on it, but Leah really was the one who pulled this all together, and who really, in particular, brought Eunice to life for me by her work on the papers with Mary McLeod Bethune, and brought Eunice's parents to life for me by the research that she did also, where we were able to find, Leah was able to find correspondence from Eunice's father, and finally brought Eunice's brother alive for me, Alpheus, her brother, whose history is also forgotten, who had degrees from Harvard and NYU. He spoke multiple languages. He was an expert on the poetry of Tennyson. And in 1951, he went to prison for refusing to name names as a communist. And his life was never the same. He could basically never get a job. He finally left the United States 6 years later, went to Africa, and never came back. He went first to Ghana, then to Zambia, and he never returned. All these are things that I wouldn't have learned if I hadn't worked in the book, and I wouldn't have learned if Leah hadn't been spending a lot of time in those dusty archives. So I was very grateful for the opportunity to come to understand my grandmother, which actually helped me understand my father better, which is part of my question to you, which is the sense that, I mean, you did a lot of research about someone who was in effect a stranger to you, and you met a lot of other strangers along the way. Do the people you learned about feel more like family now?
Yes.
And how?
So I think actually the person the person I got to know the best during the research was actually William, Eunice's father, because just reading through Howard has years of his correspondence when he was writing to his best friend, Jessie Moreland, several times a week. And just reading through all of these letters, I really feel like I got to know him with more depth than anyone else. And when I got to the end of his letters, I read his last letter before he died. And when I think, knew he was dying, he was very, very ill. And I cried in the reading room in Howard Library. Because partially it was just a moving letter, and I think partially because I felt this sense of, this is my great-great-grandfather who, even though I'd never met him and I didn't even know his name until 2 years ago, I really felt a real sense of connection to him. So yeah, this definitely did make everyone feel more like family. They feel much more like people I know.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think, even in this process of having to go through archives, about what are we doing today to keep our stories, whether that's journaling, letters? I mean, we won't have the emails per se unless we're printing them out, but I suspect that also makes it harder to get inside the head of someone if you're not reading their specific thoughts about a particular time or space.
I'd be interested to hear what Leah has to say, but every historian I know thinks it's a tragedy, it's a disaster in a sense, because you think about it, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, human beings have been recording their thoughts, their dreams, their observations, what happened yesterday, what they plan to do tomorrow, in all sorts of ways that record them permanently, where you can find them centuries later, and it's still recorded. And historians today are concerned that in a society where things are forgotten a moment later, we simply are never going to develop the same sense of recording these permanently. Think of them as recorded permanently as the copyright law says, a permanent medium of expression. But when it's a technological medium, it's simply not the same. And there's the question about whether the degradation that we all know affects every written record will affect technological records even more so. So I think it's going to be hard. I think it'll be, to be sure, it's true that we don't know everything that happened long ago. We put together the best stories we can from what we have. But there's a fear that we're going to have less. There's a fear that it's say that several hundred years from now, if they want to build up an image of everyday life, say doing social history, maybe they won't do social history anymore, but if they're still doing social history, it will be a lot harder, I think. I don't know if what you're... And also, by the way, I really like holding in my hand a piece of paper and knowing that this piece of paper was held by someone who the paper felt the same. This is the actual ink, and so it's a remarkable feeling.
I agree that is a remarkable feeling. I love archival research, and I really, really enjoyed getting to go to places and hold documents. Every time they let me hold things, I was like, really, I get to hold this letter from 1897 in my hands? But since this book has taught me to be more optimistic, I'm going to say on a more optimistic note, that is a fair concern, and I don't know, what the future will hold in terms of trying to get access to sort of digital records from this moment. But I think actually, if someone is able to get access to all of the various media that we have, there could be a really interesting portrait of everyday life that we don't have from other areas of history, because even if we're not all sitting down to write long, eloquent letters about our lives and our inner thoughts, we're sending texts every 5 seconds. Yeah, pictures of everywhere we go. Here I'm on my way to get coffee now.
Yeah, I just don't think here are some cute cats is quite the same.
But it does shed some. I don't know. It sheds important light on our lives.
That's fair. No, you make good points. Yes,
there's a lot there.
Good. I will try to be an optimist on this point. I will try not to be an old curmudgeon.
Well, I asked that because actually I think that we should all think more intently about the ways in which we are recording our stories for someone else to be able to tell them, whatever that may look like, whether or not it's journaling or writing a diary, or something like that, because without them being able to pull, digital archives, and besides what's happening in the newspaper, our personal take, on our lives.
Oh, this is good. No,
may be lost. Our personal take.
I'll send you my archives. Yale has 60 or 80 boxes of my papers.
We want them.
I'll send them to you. Fine. Okay. Yale doesn't want them.
We'll have yours and Alpheus and many other within the clan. We'll take it. So we have one last question from online. This is from Frederick. How were the Huntons able to replace their educational success over multiple generations from the turn of the 20th century onward?
So I assume when you say replace, is how they pass it on. In other words, yeah.
I think it's replicate. Right?
So that's a great question, and I wish there were a magical answer to that we all knew, so we could all do it. And I don't know the answer, but I will say two things. One is that it involves passing from generation to generation. Instead of stories about what you won't be able to do or what's going to happen to you if you cross this line. Stories about what you can do, stories that instill self-belief, which is what I grew up with, what I hope Leah grew up with, and certainly what the Hunton family grew up with their children. They really were able to raise these children, thought nothing could hold them back. But there's something else also which bears reflecting on. That's really for black people, or for our whole society, which is, we all like to say education is important, and one of the real interesting questions that all of us have to ask is not, well, what should educational policy be? What should the politicians do? But what should we do individually in our homes to further our children's education? The more that we ask ourselves questions like that and try to act on them, I think the better that generations and generations ahead will do.
I think that's a great answer. What I would add, in addition to the sense of what's possible, I think I certainly would imagine that each generation was raised with certain expectations about what they were going to do. I think there was a sense, I know for me, there was a sense of, your main job is to go to school and do well in school, and that, as a child, that was always there. I imagine it was there for you, and also there for Eunice, and I think it was there for William as well.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Today is Publications Day, so congratulations, Stephen L. Carter. Thank you for joining us, Leah Carter. You can certainly pick up Invisible here at the Schomburg shop. We will have signed copies. And if you happen to be in the area and Stephen is still around, I'm sure he would like to meet you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to clap for us.
That was really great, all of you.